Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome in to a special breaking news mini episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. My name is Ben Dubose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and a contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. This is going to be a mini episode on this Monday, August 14th, talking about the drama surrounding former Rockets James Harden and Daryl Morey with the Philadelphia 76ers. We don't have Paolo Alves, our usual co-host, on today because this is just going to be a very small episode for me to get off my thoughts and to share a little bit of intel that I've gained over the past few months of tracking down the James Harden situation as it pertains to the Rockets. Of course, he's not ultimately going to be a Rocket. Houston went a different direction in 2023 free agency, most notably signing Fred VanVleet of the Toronto Raptors as their lead guard, effectively going into what many had presumed for months would be the James Harden slot. Ime Udoka reportedly wanted to go a different way, and so James Harden since then has been lost. He thought he was leaving Philadelphia. All the reporting for months indicated that Houston, really ever since Christmas, was the likely destination. He did not get to go there. He's tried to get a trade ever since. It hasn't materialized, and things really boiled over the last couple of days. Over the weekend, it was released that Morey and the Sixers intended on bringing Harden to training camp despite the trade request, basically that the offers around the league for Harden, who turns 34 years old later this month, weren't what they needed to trade him. And as a result, because he's under contract, Harden opted in to the final year of his existing deal. They're simply going to bring him to camp. Harden on Monday fired back. He was at a camp in China. And this is as blunt as I've ever seen with criticism of an NBA executive specifically. And it's just stunning given the close relationship that these two men had over all those years in Houston. Daryl Morey is a liar, and I will never be part of an organization that he's a part of, James Harden told the crowd. Let me say that again. Daryl Morey is a liar, and I will never be a part of an organization that he's a part of. That is extraordinarily strong language, and it's stunning given the incredibly tight bond that those two men had over their many successful seasons in Houston and what ultimately should have resulted in at least one championship, if not for pick your reason. Chris Paul's hamstring, Scott Foster's officiating in Game 7, the historic outlier of an 0 for 27 shooting stretch from three-point range. It was a great run when both of those guys were in their prime. Now they're past it, or at least James Harden is, and the results in Philadelphia have not been what either wanted or hoped they would be once this reunion happened in early 2022. So let's talk about what the Rockets' connections are. I know some of you are listening and saying, look, what does any of this matter? Because the Rockets aren't going to have James Harden. They've moved on. That's fair. And if you want to skip this episode, I can't blame you. However, I do think there's at least some interesting backstory to it that can shed a little bit of light on the Rockets as an organization, what some of the considerations were for everyone involved the last few months, and perhaps where things go from here in terms of what it tells us about the organization, what it tells us about James, what his future looks like, is there potential for a reunion down the road, and so on and so forth. So I put together an extensive thread on Twitter or X at Ben Dubose, and I think all of this is mostly accurate. I'm going to paraphrase from that basically as to how we got here, because as I understand it, everything traces back to July of 2022. And this is not just from talking to people on the Rockets side of the fence. This is talking to people in Philadelphia. This is talking to people close to James. Again, I've been following this story very closely for 8 months, ever since Christmas of 2022, when it became clear that the Rockets were very much, at least in the minds of James Harden, a possibility this offseason for a reunion. And ultimately, say what you will about him now, he's still the second greatest player in franchise history behind only Hakeem Olajuwon. So in July of 2022, when James had clear maximum contract value at the time, he was just 32 years old, and the Sixers had traded a boatload for him just about 5 months earlier at that deadline. There was fairly clearly some quid pro quo involving Harden taking below the max and that enabling the Sixers to fit in PJ Tucker and Daniel House Jr., both coincidentally teammates of Harden's in Houston and players that were acquired under the regime of Daryl Morey with the Rockets. Those signings could not have been made at those dollar figures. And if they weren't at those dollar figures, they probably would have gone elsewhere unless Harden took a below max deal. So it was easy to spot from a mile away, even though technically it's tampering. Spoiler alert, this happens all around the league. It was very easy to spot that James Harden was taking a short term discount to get a better team around him. And then on the back end, he would be repaid with a full max deal in 2023. While no one can say that even today, because again, it is tampering, the reality is this happens around the NBA. It's not just a Daryl Morey thing. It's not just a Philadelphia thing. It happens everywhere. Your team does it. Their team does it. Everybody does it. It's a part of the league. It always will be, even if the league tries to call it illegal. That's just the reality of how this works. However, from December 2022 onward, really Christmas Day, the Woj leak of Harden being serious about a return to Houston, I can say very confidently that those leaks were from the James Harden side of the fence. They were from his people. The Rockets were not convinced themselves. And I think it's pretty obvious now that we know they chose to go a different direction. The Rockets were open to it. You'd be silly not to. But from their position, even though James was a very good player last season, top 15, top 20 in the league, again, he's turning 34 years old later this month. There is some risk involved with his next contract, especially if he wants a number of years. And the Rockets were going to have to weigh that risk, especially in the context of the fact that, look, they just wrapped up another rebuilding season, 22-60. It's not like you sign Harden and immediately you're a contender. So the Rockets, even more than most teams, would have to balance the short term against the long term. And then more notably, everyone knew, especially by Christmas, that the Rockets were going to have a new coaching staff in place for this upcoming season. They didn't know at that point that it would be Ime Udoka. I do think they went into the coaching search in April with an open mind, but it definitely wasn't going to be Steven Silas. And the reason that's noteworthy is because it would be foolish for Rafael Stone and Tillman Fertitta to pigeonhole themselves by going into a coaching search saying, hey, I know we have all this cap room available this offseason, but the vast majority of it, I don't care if you like it or not, it's going to James Harden. No, part of what made the Rockets attractive on the market this offseason to candidates like Ime Udoka was that they could go into it and say, look, we have another high draft pick. We have all this salary cap flexibility, and we can use that to help build the roster in a way that you see fit to play your system. In short, the Rockets didn't know their coach. And so because they didn't know their coach in December, they did not know how they wanted to play. And if they didn't know how they wanted to play, how could they know if James Harden or anyone else would really be a fit? So I think from the Rockets standpoint, I think they were flattered. At a bare minimum, it was good PR for a team as bad as the Rockets to have one of the most noteworthy free agents on the market, obviously hyping up Houston as a destination. That's really good PR, and it turned heads around the league. And so the Rockets definitely weren't going to turn it down in terms of the storylines. They weren't going to say, no, there's nothing to it. In reality, there could have been something to it in certain circumstances. It's just they chose Ime Udoka, and reporting since then has indicated that Udoka had a different vision for what he wanted to do with that role. And I think Fred VanVleet, even though he's not as dynamic as James, I think where Fred has an advantage is that he's much more plug and play. If you need to use him off the ball a bit more because Amin Thompson is ready to take over the reins as your point guard a bit earlier than expected, then Fred can still provide a ton of value with regards to his shooting off the ball, his defense. He's much more complementary. As opposed to James, there's one way that he really needs to play. And then especially if Amin Thompson ends up being a lot better sooner than you think, or perhaps Jalen Green turns out to be a little more on-ball dominant than is currently envisioned, then you'd really be in a difficult spot. I think with Fred, there's more utility as you build out your roster. And even if he's less dynamic, again, you also have to consider that it's not like the Rockets are trying to win a championship in the next year or two anyway. So I think ultimately that's why they went with Fred for that lead guard role. And then the rest of the money went to guys like Dylan Brooks, Jeff Green, Jock Landale, filling other roles in the front court and providing more defense, floor spacing, and so on and so forth. So the Rockets obviously around I would say the start of June, that was when I started getting pretty clear signals that it probably wasn't going to work out between the Rockets and Harden. And about a week or two after that was when you finally started to see that trickle into the media narrative. I think a lot of people just assumed that, well, since James wants to go to Houston, then Houston's going to be receptive. He's the second greatest player in franchise history. And quite frankly, because the Rockets have been so bad, nobody around the league even really considered the Rockets' perspective. And so it was just treated as a foregone conclusion by many that the Rockets would just give him whatever they wanted. And that's just not the way that Rafael Stone and Ime Udoka, once he was hired, were looking at this. Anyway, by mid-June at the latest, I think Harden got the memo that it wasn't going to work out with the Rockets, and he really didn't have a plan B. That's important to note. I really think that James Harden and the people around him, and it's noteworthy that he didn't have an agent until midway through this season. He's gone long stretches of his career without having an agent, and I do think that contributes to him maybe not knowing the market as well as a lot of his superstar peers. I don't think James had a plan B. While he didn't want to 100% commit until after the season ended, as I understand it, James's approach was basically let's get through the season in Philadelphia and take stock in the offseason. But clearly, the interest in Houston was real. And I think from their side of the fence, it was a matter of just getting to the offseason and dotting the I's, crossing the T's, and getting the deal done. I don't think they had a plan B. I think they assumed it would work out because it almost always has in the past. He's been that powerful. He's been that good. He's a former MVP, a perennial all-star. However, again, this is a summer in which he turns 34 years old. Things have changed. He's not the same guy that he was 4 or 5 years ago at the peak of his powers. And so once James realized that it wasn't happening in Houston, the next best alternative for him was going back to Philadelphia and getting that 4-year max that had basically been agreed to a year ago. It's not as if things went terribly with the 76ers. Again, they won 50 plus games. They've got an MVP in Joel Embiid. They made it to game 7 of a second round series against Boston, which is one of the NBA's best teams. I know that game 7 went very poorly, but it's not like the Sixers are that far away. It's not a terrible situation by any means. Joel Embiid's still in place. Not like he's demanded a trade or anything like that. I don't think it's his home. I don't think it's where he wants to be. It's not perfect. But I think if the money was right, he would swallow his pride. And so I think in June, James went back to Philadelphia expecting that the deal that was largely agreed to a year ago would still be there for him, especially because, again, it wasn't like he ever 100% said, I'm going to Houston. The interest was clear. He put the feelers out there. But in terms of dotting the I's and crossing the T's, it was always, let's just pick this up in the offseason. And so from James's perspective, that meant that nothing had been committed to. And so everything that was on the table previously is still there. From Philadelphia's perspective, and this is not source, this is me sort of reading the tea leaves, but I'm sure reading all of these reports and learning that James was so desperate to return to Houston. Keep in mind, Daryl Morey and Rafael Stone are still good friends, even though they're competitors. I'm sure Daryl, on some level, asked Rafael of his interest, and I can't imagine that Rafael told him, yeah, we definitely want James 100%, because obviously that was not the case. I think it was pretty clear once you paid attention to the reporting that the source was James Harden or people close to him. And so if you're the 76ers, if you're Daryl Morey, you look at that and you say, wait a minute. If James is backing out of this alleged agreement or understanding, this quid pro quo, then why am I married to my end of this? He's already violating the spirit of it. That's how I suspect Daryl Morey is looking at it, especially because by the time James Harden learned that the Rockets weren't going to be interested in him, it wasn't like there was a backup plan on the free agency market this summer. He didn't really have any other options because, again, most of the teams with cap space, they're really bad. They don't make sense for a 33-year-old, soon to be 34, James Harden. The only reason Houston did is because it's his former home, and there are some extenuating circumstances. The draft capital owed to Oklahoma City. The Rockets trying to turn this around sooner rather than later, not quite the typical rebuilding timeline. most of the other teams don't make sense for James, and many of them had also made plans to do things with their cap space by the time James learned in June that Houston wasn't going to work out. Many of those other teams, even if James was open to going to a rebuilding team, well, some of them had already agreed to deals with either other free agents. I know it's illegal, but come on, that stuff does happen, or perhaps with trades, taking on bad salaries for assets. We all know how the league works. Basically, the cap space was spoken for. There were teams interested in James for sure. It's not like no one has interest in him. He's a very good player, but most of them don't have cap space. They're the contenders that could really use James Harden to get them over the hump, but those teams don't have the cap space to give him the max or anything close to it. So when Houston pivoted to the Fred and Dylan plan, then not only was it clear that Harden had gone back on his word and the original sentiment of that quid pro quo from July of 2022, but Daryl Morey also realized that there was no external leverage, in that it wasn't like there was another team willing to give James Harden the max. I don't know if there was for 1 year, let alone 4 years, to really pressure the Sixers into giving him big money. That type of 4 year, give or take $200 million deal that could be offered to James Harden through his age 37 season. And so just think of it from Daryl's perspective. I'm sure he's looking at this saying, hold on, James already violated the spirit of the agreement. And who am I bidding against? I'm basically bidding against myself. Why am I going to offer James the max when there's no alternative and he's already sort of broken his word on this? Why am I going to hold up my end of the bargain when James clearly wasn't hoping to hold up his? And Daryl did what he's done throughout his tenure in the NBA. He's trying to get the best value that he can for his organization so that he can use that money elsewhere to try and build a title contender, which is something, well, he's built a contender before, but he's not built a championship team yet. That's still the white whale that he's trying to achieve with the Philadelphia 76ers. And Daryl Morey, well, I should say James Harden, has seen Daryl Morey operate in such a cutthroat manager for years. I think one of the ultimate ironies in this situation, both James and Daryl, I think, were a bit too prideful in that they never thought that the other person could do it to them. Daryl had seen James ask out and get ugly in a number of situations when he's not happy trying to bully his way out of town. I just don't believe that Daryl, that is, thought that James would use those tactics on him based on their relationship. Similarly, we saw in Houston, and certainly James over his time here, saw Daryl treat a lot of players like assets. That stigma was out there for a reason. Look at Chris Paul, who was told he wasn't going to be traded, and then less than a month later was shipped out for Russell Westbrook. Now, I know that that move happened at the behest of James Harden, but at the end of the day, if you're not an MVP level guy like James, the point is that to Daryl, you're expendable. You can say all the right things, and he has, and then he'll turn around and do what needs to be done. In this case, it wasn't so much that Daryl believed the CP3 for Russ trade was best for the organization. It was more that, well, because Harden wants it, it's best for the organization to keep Harden happy and keep him from demanding a trade. But regardless, it's the same end goal. It's, look, this guy is a means to an end. And if you're not an MVP in the prime of your career, you're expendable. And James Harden, while still a very good player, he's 33 years old now, about to be 34. While still very good, he's expendable. In many ways, it's analogous to where Chris Paul was 4 years ago when all that drama happened involving Daryl Morey. So while Daryl should have seen and shouldn't have been surprised at James's willingness to do something like this, conversely, I think James should not be surprised that Daryl Morey, once he saw an opening, was willing to go back on his word. I think James assumed that he would be treated like the god he was 4 or 5 years ago when he was an MVP and still in his 20s. But right now, while still a good player, he's not quite at that level. So Daryl is more willing to drive a hard bargain in these talks. And again, a lot of this I do think goes back to James not having an agent. I don't think that he had the people around him, at least not before the last 6 months. And now it's just too late, I think. I don't think he had the people around him the last few years to really loop him in on how the market was changing for him and that he needed to have more contingencies. Because again, this can happen so quickly in the NBA when you're in your 30s. Look at Carmelo Anthony, who within a couple of years went from being a highly desirable, perceived superstar to a guy who couldn't even get a job. It can happen really, really quickly when you're in your 30s and your skills start to decline a little bit, especially if there's fair or unfair, perceived to be some baggage as well in terms of that person's potential fit in the locker room. How committed are they to the defensive end of the court, their leadership qualities, and so on and so forth. I don't think James had people in his ear that were warning him of those dynamics. I think he assumed he was still the same guy as 4 or 5 years ago, that all he needed was a plan A to know what he wanted. He wanted Houston and assumed that as long as nothing changed, it would be simple as dotting the I's and crossing the T's. It didn't happen. There was no plan B. And so because there was no plan B, not only was he boxed in with Philadelphia, but that also presented no leverage to force Philadelphia into giving him money. So he didn't want to be there, and he had no ability to get the money from the Sixers. So it was just a very difficult spot. And initially, I wondered when James opted in, and we heard immediately on June 29th that James opted in hopes of getting a trade. Initially today, I wondered, did Daryl Morey tell him to opt in? Because obviously it would make him on a 1 year deal at roughly $30 million, not that expensive. That would open up his trade market by not putting a big number on the books, sort of like Chris Paul in 2017 when he opted in to facilitate his trade to Houston. Is James really mad because Daryl Morey lied to him a second time, telling him, hey, if you opt in, I'll trade you. And now that the offers didn't materialize, Daryl is walking it back and saying, well, now you're under contract, suck it. Actually, no, I'm told that's not the way it happened. James opted in because it was his best financial option. Outside of the Rockets, he had not developed a plan B, and many of the teams with cap space had already developed alternative plans for that, or maybe they weren't going to be a fit for Harden because they're a rebuilding team and he's about to be 34 years old. And so Harden opting in for that 1 year deal worth about $30 million or whatever it is, as I understand it, that was his best financial play, period. And so Daryl Morey did not give him assurances at the end of June that he was going to be traded. No, James just simply opted in because it was the best option available to him financially at the time. And since then, he's been trying to figure it out. Ultimately, the offers that came in to Philadelphia were not as lucrative as Morey and the Sixers had thought. And so now we're in this really, really awkward place with two guys who, again, were probably the most powerful men in the Rockets organization in the decade of the 2010s. Daryl Morey as GM, he was the architect. James Harden as superstar player. Obviously, he was the best player of the decade. He was the best player, again, in franchise history after Hakeem Olajuwon. Say what you will about how things have transpired since, but at his prime, he was an excellent, excellent player. And so it's just led to this very toxic situation. And I don't know where things go from here. It's interesting. If Harden is primarily upset with Daryl Morey and not the organization, and I do think that it was clear that in these comments today, it was Daryl under attack, not the Philadelphia 76ers, then could you get James back in the fold? And whether you believe in him as a long-term fit next to Joel Embiid or not, at least just buy some time until this blows over and then closer to the trade deadline, maybe analogous to Ben Simmons a couple of years ago in the way the Sixers handled that situation. You find more value for him at the deadline, more guys come available. Perhaps James can just basically put on a happy face for a few months and they can mutually work on deals at a time that are more advantageous to the organization. I think from a strict value perspective, that's better than selling James for pennies on the dollar now because there's not much of a market, or taking him into a training camp in which, I mean, we saw in late 2020 the way it can go when James is really unhappy. It can be really, really bad. And of course, the circus and the effect that that has not just on James and the value that he provides you, but on the entire team and what you're trying to build in terms of camaraderie, chemistry, and so on and so forth. That's a very real consideration for the Sixers. And from a strict value perspective, if you could get rid of Daryl and have have James Harden, bought in, I think you have to consider it. But the flip side is that I don't think you can literally let Daryl go. I mean, number one, on the balance, he's still a very, very good GM, even if he does have a few blind spots with regards to, I suppose, the personal factors. And in this case, he's technically not a GM. He's head of basketball operations, but same thing, lead of basketball operations. I think in this case, the precedent it would set to force Daryl Morey out at the behest of not even a superstar James Harden. At this point, a 34-year-old James Harden, that would look comically bad. Maybe there's an arrangement where Daryl can resign or quit, go quietly into the night, retire, and try to find a situation elsewhere. I don't know. But even then, I think people might sniff it out as, hey, the Sixers sort of pushed him into this because of James Harden. And the precedent that sets letting a player run your organization to that extent, not even an in his prime superstar in this case, that's really bad. There's no easy answer here whatsoever. And where this gets really tricky, Daryl Morey is taking it on the chin from players around the league. Kyrie Irving chimed in on Twitter. I heard Danny Green on ESPN's NBA Today basically saying that if Morey and the Sixers promised Harden something, they should live up to that promise. Players are sensitive to this because, again, tampering happens. This is not unique to the Philadelphia 76ers. It happens all around the league. And so players see this and they think, well, if that happened to James Harden, it could happen to me, especially because most players aren't as good as James Harden. And so they think of how they would feel if they were in his shoes. And superficially, it's going to be a player friendly narrative. And this is an NBA where player empowerment is the way it works. Now, in this case, I think Daryl would want everyone to know that it's not that simple. James didn't live up to his word on his end of that quid pro quo. And I think that's true. However, Daryl can't say or even leak that because that would acknowledge the tampering. That even if it goes on, look, if the NBA gets wind of that, we've seen teams docked second round picks for far less severe cases. This would be a blatant example. And so Daryl is sort of boxed in. It's not like he's going to say that James backed out of his side of the agreement. And also, even if he somehow could, why is James this way? Why does James think that he can have his cake and eat it too? Why does James think, because I do think you can make a compelling argument just in terms of logic and fairness that, hey, if you had this quid pro quo, but James Harden clearly didn't feel it applied to him to the extent that he was sending all sorts of feelers, he and his people, that Houston was where he wanted to be, then why should Daryl Morey hold up his end of that same negotiation in Philadelphia? Why does James think that he's above it? And it's largely because James has been treated for a decade, largely by Daryl Morey with the Rockets, as though he is above it, as though there is a different set of rules for James as a superstar. And while it's not all Daryl Morey, that's part of it. The culture has been written. Again, James had his own set of rules with the Rockets. It's been extensively reported on by Tim McMahon in terms of travel. He would stay over in Vegas and LA. He would arrive a day late. He wasn't one of the guys. And this is the last point I want to get to on this. And ultimately, this is where I do think you can take some consolation that maybe the Rockets made the right decision. I was someone that over the last 6 months, I was very open to the Harden return scenario. I'm not going to lie. I would have loved seeing the second best player in franchise history back in a Rockets uniform. And as terrible as things ended in 2021, to write a new ending, to have James Harden leading this new group into the future. And even if he doesn't win a championship here, it would just be a better way to conclude his story with the Rockets. Superficially, I wanted it, but I wanted it under certain conditions. And one of those was that if James was going to return, he needed to be one of 15. He needed to be on the same playing field as everybody else. Because I don't think what the Rockets wanted was to have James Harden with his own rules. Number one, he's not as good as he used to be, and he's older. But even if this was a slightly younger James Harden, again, it's fair to wonder, it's not like the Rockets, even with James Harden at the peak of his powers, ever won a title. It's not like those were perfect basketball teams. It's not like that was the perfect model. There were limitations, and clearly superstars around the league eventually got tired of James. Chris, Russ, Dwight, none of them in the years since have said that many nice things about their experience with James. I do think there are limitations to that model of building everything around James. And the Rockets under Rafael Stone and Ime Udoka don't want to do that for the next generation with Jalen Green, Jabari Smith Jr., Amin Thompson, Alperen Şengün. They want it to be much more of a team approach, that it's not about one or two guys, it's about the collective. And so I was hopeful that James in his 30s would be more amenable to accepting a more team structured role, unlike his first stint with the Rockets. But if James is still doing this, If this went down the way I think, and again, I don't know this, but I have a strong intuition based on talking to people on multiple sides of this equation. If James still thinks that he's above it, that even though he clearly flirted with Houston during this past season and that violated the quid pro quo, that Daryl Morey should still be beholden to his end of it, just on a fairness level, that's not fair. Again, it's not as simple as making that argument because of tampering and all the other concerns. And Daryl did contribute to James perhaps having a bigger ego and so on and so forth. So it's not as easy as Daryl Morey just making that argument to the media and then case closed. But at a root level, yeah, I do think that Daryl is more right than James in this case, even if Daryl contributed to James having this approach. Look, it is like James is trying to have his cake and eat it too. There is a bit of a double standard. And if James is still trying to do that, because I can't imagine that he thinks that any player in a negotiation with a GM should be subject to that. Otherwise, these agreements would basically mean nothing. If everybody could do that, then even these wink wink agreements would ultimately mean nothing. People would just back out, and then what's the point? He has to think implicitly that the rules are different for him because he's James Harden. And that is something that I had hoped now that he's about to be 34 that he had gotten away from, but it seems like he still hasn't. And if that's the case, boy, I don't know if he'll ever get it. And so beyond just not working out now, it's hard to imagine if it's ever going to work out. Even if he's a free agent again, as currently constructed, he could hit the market next off season. I just don't know if it's ever going to make sense. I hope it does because he's still a good player. I would love for him to rewrite his story in Houston, but a condition of that, it was always going to be, is James Harden willing a second time around to be one of 15 and to not have it all about him? The way this went down between Harden and Morey tells you, or it should tell you, in my opinion, that it's still about James, that he still wants his own rules. And that's not to make Daryl Morey out to be a sympathetic figure. Absolutely not. There's blame to go on both sides of this because, again, it's that Daryl Morey approach that led James Harden to be this way. The way I put it on Twitter was, yeah, James is a monster, but he's a monster of Daryl's creation. So it's sort of ironic that this is how it plays out, that both of these guys are victims of the other style that they just thought, they saw it happen to lots of other people, but they never thought it would happen to them. James, from the standpoint of, he saw Daryl treat lots of players like assets. Now he seems to feel that way. But Daryl, from the standpoint of, he saw James, he had a front row seat and enabled James to act like this for a number of years in Houston. So now it's not to say that Daryl's a sympathetic figure. No, he's the guy who made James this way. So perhaps it's fitting that he's the latest victim of this scenario. But as far as the Rockets, I think the one consolation you can have, I don't think it's fair to say like an apples to apples. I saw some people saying that, oh, this is a bullet dodged and this is what would have happened if James had signed with the Rockets. I don't think so. I think if James had signed with the Rockets and, the Rockets had wanted him, then James would have been happy. So at least for now, it's not an apples to apples. I do think he wants out of Philadelphia. He wanted to be in Houston. And so in the short term, it would have been fine. But I do think that it would have been something of a ticking time bomb, that while it wouldn't happen now, you would still have to worry about, well, what happens the next time that he's unhappy? What happens when he wants his own rules as it pertains to plane flights and travel and logistics and everything that accompanies the James Harden style in the NBA? I don't know if James Harden is ever going to be one of 15 after this. And so because of that, he probably doesn't make sense for where the Rockets want to go. I think it's a sad ending to the story. It could have been better, but ultimately, again, I think it tells you a little bit about James Harden. And while I think Daryl Morey is quote unquote right in regards to what I think the point of dispute is in this, it's all traces back to, look, if James can violate this quid pro quo by clearly shopping himself to the Rockets and having one foot out the door, not being fully committed, then why should I hold up my end of the bargain, especially when there's no outside leverage financially? Daryl's not a sympathetic figure either because he's the one who led to this version of James Harden and enabled him for so many years in Houston. So perhaps it's fitting. It sucks because I like both of those guys. They provided lots of great basketball memories in Houston, even if there was no title. But ultimately, while it's not a Rockets story, there are definitely Rockets links to it. And I do think that if it wasn't closed already, today probably closes the door on the potential of Harden ever returning to the Rockets. This should show you that it's same old James, although at this point, it's same old James from the mental side without physically being as gifted as he was 4 or 5 years ago. And that's just a bad mix when you have a lot of impressionable young guys the way the Rockets do now. So now I think with this, even people that were hesitant to buy in on the direction they picked, and I do think that Fred had a pretty strong approval rating. My suspicion is that it's even stronger now because it's pretty clear that in terms of just the clubhouse mix and making that locker room work, the way the Rockets went is for the best. And as far as James and Daryl, I like them as people. I would love to see James Harden win a championship still, but I'm pretty convinced after this that the door is closed, at least at a somewhat star level on ever returning to Houston. You never say never. Maybe the same way we saw Tracy McGrady on the bench of a finals team with the Spurs. Maybe at the end of his career, James Harden comes back when he's clearly at a different spot. But in terms of James at anywhere near peak powers, at this point, I'm giving up. He is what he is. It's not going to be a fit for the Rockets. And with that, we can close the door on that, and we can officially close this chapter of the James Harden Rockets story. Anyway, that'll do it for this mini episode of the Logger Line. We'll be back with more content in the near future. There is going to be a schedule release later this week, so Paolo and myself, and perhaps a guest as well, will react to that when the Rockets learn who they're going to play and when over this upcoming 2023 to 24 NBA season with Fred VanVleet, not James Harden leading the way. Anyway, until that next episode, if you want more content from me, you can get it on Twitter/X at PenDubose. You can also go to the Logger Line, where you can hit up our link tree, and from there you can find all the resources that you need for friends and partners of this program: Sports Talk 790, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Karbach Brewing, where this show is developed in collaboration with Karbach and Clutch City Lager, their beer with the Houston Rockets. You can find all of their info at our link tree. You can also hit up Apple, Google, Spotify, all of our distributors. You can find where to listen to this show there as well. This is where we will break for today. Please come back soon for another new show.